Welcome to our program again, and a very, very exciting program today entitled The Unfolding of the Revelation. Prior to the Second World War, the 350 square kilometre island of Guam was controlled by the United States of America. Then you'll remember on December 7, 1941, Japan attacked Guam and took it from the United States. And then on July 21, 1944, the United States got it back from Japan. And for months after, they were rounding up Japanese soldiers, placed them in internment camps until the war was over, when they were released. Then in 1960, 15 years after the war was over, a Guamanian was out in the bush when he thought he saw a Japanese soldier up a tree. Thought to himself, that cannot be. But he was fairly convinced. And then later on that day, he thought he saw another one in the bush. So when he went back home, he reported it to the authorities. They likewise couldn't believe it, but they did send out a search party. And lo and behold, eventually they turned up these two Japanese soldiers. Now, when they found them, of course, their clothes were all tattered and torn. Their skin was ulcerated and mosquito bitten. They were in a mess. So they brought them back and looked after them and then tried to tell them that the war was over. But do you know, nothing that they could say would lead these two Japanese soldiers to believe that the war was over. They just interpreted this as another trick of the Allies. So under more questioning, eventually they found that one of them had a sister. So they traced her down and got the authorities back in Tokyo to try to find this woman, and eventually they did, and they explained to her that they had her brother. Well, she was shocked, of course. She thought he was dead years and years ago. And so they said, look, we're trying to convince him that the war was over. Will you get on the telephone and try to tell him? Maybe he'll believe you. But nothing she would say would convince him that the war was over. Finally, they put them on an aeroplane, landed them back on the tarmac in Tokyo, and when they got off the plane, not only were their family there ready to meet them, but they couldn't believe, when they looked around, they couldn't believe what they saw. Because as you can appreciate, the Tokyo prior to the war was a very different Tokyo to what it was in 1960. You know, I've often thought about that illustration, and I've thought about those two men living more like animals than human beings. All those years, they could have been back in comfort living in Japan. But it's like many folk today in the world. It's like a parable, this story, because there are millions of people today who do not know that peace has been declared between God and man through Jesus as his death on the cross. They don't know that God has a special message in these last days, and the purpose of this message is to get people ready for the return of Jesus. And that's what our subject is today, to look at this amazing message that's contained in the book of Revelation, the most exciting book in the New Testament, really, because it brings together everything in these last days to get us ready for the return of Jesus. And so I'd like you to open your Bibles to Revelation, the 14th chapter, page 1183 at the back of the Bible, 1183, Revelation chapter 14 and verse 6. And this is what it says. Then I saw another angel flying in the midst of heaven, having the everlasting gospel to preach to those who dwell on the earth, to every nation, kindred, tribe, and people, saying with a loud voice, fear God and give glory to him, for the hour of his judgment has come. And worship him who made heaven and earth, the sea, and the springs of waters. Then verse 8 says, and another angel followed, saying, Babylon is fallen, that great city, because she has made all nations drink of the wine of the wrath of her fornication. Then a third angel followed them, saying with a loud voice, if anyone worships the beast and his image, and receives his mark on his forehead or on his hand, he himself shall also drink of the wine of the wrath of God, which is poured full strength into the cup of his indignation. He shall be tormented with fire and brimstone in the presence of the holy angels and in the presence of the Lamb. and the smoke of their torment ascends for ever and ever. And they have no rest day or night, who worship the beast and his image, and whoever receives the mark of his name. Here is the patience of the saints. Here are those who keep the commandments of God and the faith of Jesus. So you see, here are three angels flying in mid-heaven. And they have these three messages. Now, we know that literal angels don't preach. That work has been given to mankind to do. I mean, they could preach, and they would be willing to preach. But God has given the message of the everlasting gospel to you and to me to preach. But under the figure of these three angels, we have these three messages going to every nation, kindred, tongue, and people. Because you see, the word angel, angelos, in the Greek simply means message or messenger. And under the figure of these three angels flying in mid-heaven, so that everybody can see them and hear this message, it goes to the entire world. And I want you to notice what happens as soon as these three messages go to the world, what happens next. This is verse 13. Then I heard a voice from heaven saying to me, "Write, blessed are the dead who die in the Lord from now on. Yes," said the Spirit, "that they may rest from their labours, and their works follow them." Then I looked, and behold, a white cloud, and on the cloud one sat like unto the Son of Man, having on his head a golden crown, and in his hand a sharp sickle. And another angel came out of the temple, crying with a loud voice to him who sat on the cloud, "Thrust in your sickle and reap, for the time has come for you to reap, for the harvest of the earth is ripe." Now, there's something that we're going to notice about the Bible, and particularly in the books of Daniel and Revelation, that there are lots of symbols used. And remember the other session that we were together, we pointed out when we learnt to study the Bible, how to study and understand the Bible, that we allow the Bible to be its own interpreter. That is, one part of the Bible always explains another. And here we have a picture of the Son of Man coming with a sickle in his hand, ready to reap the harvest of the earth. Now, the question is, what is this harvest? You know, we could speculate, couldn't we, as to what the harvest is. Some people think it's this, some people may think it's that, and some other people may think it's something else. But that's not the way we're to study the Bible. We are to allow the Bible to be its own interpreter. So let's go back and find what the Bible means by the harvest. Let's go back to the book of Matthew, the 13th chapter. And it's not surprising to find that Matthew and Jesus explains some of the symbols in Revelation, because the Revelation is the revelation of Jesus. It's Jesus' own book. So you see, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are about the work of Jesus. Revelation is written by Jesus. It's the revelation of Jesus Christ. So let's have a look at, this time, Matthew chapter 13 and verse 38. Notice it's in red, the words of Jesus. "The field is the world, the good seeds are the sons of the kingdom, but the tares are the sons of the wicked one. The enemy who sowed them is the devil. The harvest is the end of the age, and the reapers are the angels." So here Jesus has made it very clear what the harvest represents. It is the end of the age, or the end of the world. In other words, just as the farmer has the harvest as the culmination of his work for the year, so Jesus is using terminology that would have been understood by those agricultural people, those farmers, to understand the harvest represents the coming of Jesus. So you see, the purpose of these three messages in Revelation 14, the first angel's message, the second angel's message, and the third angel's message, is to get people ready for the return of Jesus. They're the last message that goes to the world before Christ returns, to every nation, kindred, tongue, and people. Now you see, when Jesus came the first time, at the first advent, when Christ was born in Bethlehem, God had his messenger, or his angel, so to speak, to prepare the then known world for the coming of Jesus the first time. Let me read that to you. Come back to the book of Malachi. By the way, that's the book right alongside Matthew. It's the last book of the Old Testament. It's Malachi chapter 3 and verse 1, page 930. 930. Malachi chapter 3 and verse 1. And this is what it says. Listen to this prophecy. Behold, I send my messenger, and he will prepare the way before me. And the Lord whom ye seek will suddenly come to his temple, even the messenger of the covenant, in whom you delight. Behold, he is coming, says the Lord of hosts. Now here is a prediction. And you'll notice that the messenger is spoken of in this verse a couple of times. One is spelt with a small m and the other with a big M, indicating one represents Christ and the other is a messenger that prepares the way for the messenger. Let's notice it again in verse 1. Behold, I send my messenger. You see, small m. And he will prepare the way before me. So here is a prediction where God is saying that God is going to send his messenger or his angel, and he's going to prepare the world for the coming of the messenger, spelt with a capital M, Jesus Christ himself. Now, once again, I guess we could speculate and say, what does all this mean? But do you know, one of the most wonderful things about the Bible is, as we've noticed, the Bible explains itself. And if you come over now to the New Testament, Matthew chapter 11, page 945, Matthew 11 and verse 10, notice the fulfillment of that prophecy. You'll hear the same words that are used. Listen. For this is he of whom it is written, Behold, I send my messenger before your face, who will prepare your way before you. Now, we've just read those words, haven't we, back in Malachi? Because what Matthew is doing here is he's picking up the prophecy from Malachi, and he's now saying it's going to be fulfilled. Now, who was the messenger that God had to prepare the way for the coming of Jesus, the messenger? Who was it? Well, I'm hearing it. But let's read it from verse 11. It says, Assuredly I say to you, among those born of women there hath not risen one greater than whom? John the Baptist. So you see, John the Baptist was God's messenger to prepare the way for the coming of Jesus the first time. He was raised up by God. Prophecy had pointed out that God was going to send his messenger. Now, in these last days, when God has a message that's not going only to Palestine or to Israel, but rather it is a message that's going to every nation, kindred, tongue and people, in other words, clear around the world, God doesn't have one messenger. Revelation says he has three, under the figure of three angels. And the purpose of those three messages is to get the world ready and prepared for Jesus' return. Let's go back and have a look now at Revelation chapter 14. You know, I am quite convinced that one of the reasons why God has allowed all of the discoveries to take place in the days in which we live is not because we're smarter people. I notice that archaeologists are quite convinced that the further you go back in history, the more brilliant is the civilization. Take the Egyptian civilization and some of those ancient Babylonian civilization. Amazing. But the reason that this generation, in this modern time, we have discovered all these marvelous inventions is not because we're smarter, but because God's message has to be taken to every nation, kindred, tongue and people. And you take satellites today and the ability to be able to communicate as we live in such an amazing world. And while it is true many of these things are being prostituted by the devil, nevertheless God is able to use them too. And he's using them to take the message. Well, let's go over to Revelation 14, God's last message to the world. And that message is to prepare people for the return of Jesus. So let's have a look at it in more detail now. Revelation chapter 14, and we'll pick up verse 6 on page 1183. Revelation 14, verse 6, that says, Then I saw another angel, or another message, flying in the midst of heaven, having the everlasting gospel to preach to those who dwell on the earth, to every nation, tribe, tongue, and people. Now you'll notice that this is the everlasting gospel. It's not some newfangled idea that's been concocted by some queer sect in the last days. This is the gospel that's always been true. The only difference is that this gospel is going to have the contemporary issues at stake here. That's going to nominate and specify the particular issues that are going to be relevant to the generation that lives just before Jesus returns. And what are those particular relevant contemporary issues? Have a look at verse 7. Saying with a loud voice, "Fear God and give glory to him, for the hour of his judgment has come. And worship him who made heaven and earth, the sea, and the springs of waters." So here we find an emphasis in this first message, an emphasis on the everlasting gospel, the fact that the hour of God's judgment has come. This is not talking about the judgment that is to come at the last, right when Jesus returns. Obviously, when people give this message, they must know when the judgment begins. And there's a call here to worship God as the Creator. Worship him who made the heavens and the earth. Why would that be relevant, do you think, today? Why is it important that we worship God as the Creator today? Well, because just about every institution of learning around this world is pouring out the damnable theory of evolution, which teaches that God didn't make the world, that we just came here by chance. And God knew that 2,000 years ago, and he said part of the contemporary message of the everlasting gospel is to emphasize the fact that God is the Creator. You know, there's something else that's very, very interesting here in the book of Revelation that we're going to notice in our coming programs. It's this. The book of Revelation points out that for every truth that God has in his word, the devil has a counterfeit. And you know what a counterfeit is? A counterfeit looks like, feels like, and appears like the real thing. For example, if I was to pass around a $100 note, and I didn't tell you it was a counterfeit, most of us would not know the difference, because we're not trained to be able to see the slight differences. And you can understand that if it's a counterfeit $100 note, it'll have the same colour, it will look like, appear like, even feel like the real thing. But there will be a difference, even though it might only be slight. And that's the way the devil works with truth. God has a truth, and what the devil does is he brings a counterfeit, and that counterfeit will look like, appear like, and in every way seem like the real thing. It will even use the same biblical terminologies. Can you see how subtle the devil is? And why it's important for us to know the Word, and particularly the book of Revelation, because it is his purpose through Revelation to expose the devil's counterfeit. Can you understand now why you've hardly heard much about the Revelation? Because the devil has a vested interest to make sure that you never study it and that it's never preached about. Because once we understand Revelation, then the devil's whole plan is unveiled. Now, I mentioned that for every truth that God has in the Bible, there is a counterfeit. And night by night, session by session, what we're going to do is we will first of all study the truth, because it's much easier to be able to pick the counterfeit once you know the genuine. We'll study the genuine first, and then we'll be able to pick the counterfeit. But here, look, let me just point this out to you. Here we have three messages. And God has three messages going to the world, but you know the devil has three messages. Just turn over the page to Revelation, this time chapter 16 and verse 12. Revelation 16. And verse 12, it says, "Then the sixth angel poured out his bowl on the great river Euphrates, and its water was dried up, so that the way of the kings from the east might be prepared. And I saw three unclean spirits like frogs, coming out of the mouth of the dragon, out of the mouth of the beast, and out of the mouth of the false prophet." You see, just as God has three messages, the devil has three agents as well, three messengers. They are, as it says here, the dragon, the beast, and the false prophet. And they are doing the devil's bidding. How do we know that? Have a look at the next verse now, verse 14. "For they are the spirits of demons, performing signs," or miracles, "which go out to the kings of the earth and of the whole world to gather them to that battle of that great day almighty." And Jesus adds, "Behold, I'm coming as a thief. Blessed is he who watches and keeps his garments, lest he walk naked and they see his shame." So you see, just as God has 3 messages going to the world, the devil has 3 messages going to the entire world, and it's to gather them to that last great battle, the battle of Armageddon. And the issue is going to be over worship. Because remember in Revelation 14:6 and 7 it says, "Worship him who made the heavens and the earth." Here it talks about the fact that the unclean spirits out of the mouth of the beast and the dragon and the false prophet, for they are the spirits of demons performing miracles. You know, today, if a miracle was to take place in town, most of us would think that that miracle was from God, because we have been led to believe that God performs miracles. Now, God does perform miracles, and I want to tell you, I believe in a God of miracles. It's wonderful to believe in a God of miracles, but the Bible tells me that God is not the only author of miracles. The devil can perform miracles. You may remember when Moses threw his staff down, it changed into a serpent, and Pharaoh's magicians threw their staves down, and they changed into snakes too. People say to me, "Well, why would the devil perform miracles?" The devil can make a person sick, friends, and then make them well again. Why would he do that? So that they will be confirmed more and more in their counterfeit error. And I've had people say to me, "Well, I know what you're saying from the Bible seems to be right, but in my church there are miracles taking place, and I'm convinced that we're right." Listen, friends, it is a very dangerous thing to base a religion on so-called miracles. Because here we're warned, here's a verse that very clearly says that this is going to be the major agency of the devil himself to deceive the whole world. He's going to use miracles as his most cunning deception. That's why we need to be very careful. So just as the devil has 3 messages, God has 3 messages. And tonight we said that we're going to look at God's message, and then we will expose a little later who the devil is, who the dragon is, who the false prophet is, and of course who the beast is. That will be further programs, and I hope that you'll be able to see those. Now let's have a look at Revelation chapter 14 and the second message now, starting at verse 8. "And another angel followed, saying, Babylon is fallen, that great city, because she made all nations drink of the wine of the wrath of her fornication." So you see here the second message concerns the fall of Babylon. Now, obviously this is not the old city of Babylon, because Babylon has well and truly gone. God said it would never be inhabited. But this is talking here about that same system of religion that began back in ancient Babylon. Remember, Babylon in the old times was built by Nimrod in opposition to God. God said, "Go out and fill the earth." They said, "No, we're going to build a city." And they built the Tower of Babel to defy God, so that if a flood ever came, they would scurry to the top and be saved. You know, God must laugh at our foolishness, mustn't he? But Babylon was set up in direct opposition to God, and they developed a religion which was a counterfeit to what God gave originally. And so Babylon is used as a symbol of that counterfeit religion in the last days that is based and comes from ancient Babylon, but is still in rebellion against God. And it says here, she has made all the nations, the whole world, drink of that wine of her fornication. In other words, the whole world has become influenced and intoxicated on Babylon's maddening wine. She's committed fornication, and fornication is an illicit relationship. So we find here in the second message that God is going to explain to us about the book of Revelation and tell us about Babylon. Then notice the third message. "Then a third angel followed them, saying with a loud voice, If anyone worships the beast and his image, and receives his mark on his forehead or on his hand, he himself shall also drink of the wine of the wrath of God, which is poured out full strength into the cup of his indignation. He shall be tormented with fire and brimstone in the presence of the holy angels and in the presence of the Lamb. And the smoke of their torment ascends for ever and ever, and they have no rest day or night, who worship the beast and his image, and whoever receives the mark of his name. So you see, the third message is a warning, the most dreadful warning that you'll ever read anywhere in Scripture against the mark of the beast. And yet, you know, friends, and I don't want to sound critical in saying this, but you could go along to the average church for 50 years and never hear an explanation about what the mark of the beast is. Can you see why God has a special message in these last days? And then in verse 12 it says this: "Here is the patience of the saints. Here are those who keep the commandments of God and the faith of Jesus." God points out his people in contrast to those who get the mark of the beast. You see, whatever the mark of the beast is, it is the opposite to keeping God's commandments. It's the opposite to being faithful to Jesus and faithful to his 10 commandments. And God is looking for a people in these last days who are going to be faithful to him and faithful to his commandments. You know, everywhere I go these days, I have people come along to me and they say, "Geoff, why are you so excited about those commandments? Don't you know the commandments have been done away with? Or they've been nailed to the cross." And they misquote a verse in Romans, "You're not under the law, but you're under grace." And they feel that those verses teach that we are no longer under any obligation to be obedient to God. Listen, whenever I find a people like that, friends, I know that they haven't got God's truth. Because God's message, according to Revelation, concerns the people, the saints of God, who will be faithful to Jesus and faithful to his commandments. And I'm looking around for a people like that. And I hope by God's grace you're looking for a people like that. Because they are God's saints. They're not some deluded fools or some legalists or something like that. They love Jesus supremely. And one of the things that this message emphasizes is the fact that being faithful to Jesus doesn't mean that you're not faithful to his commandments. But the two things go together. And, well, people say to me, "Which church?" Well, actually, friends, it's not a matter of a church at all, because it is God's intention that every people, every church, accept these 3 messages. In fact, this is the most important message that's going on in the world today. Vastly more important than what happens over there in the Middle East, important as that may be, or anywhere else around the world. This is God's last message that goes to the world. And I know that because that's what the book of Revelation says. Because as soon as these 3 messages go to the world, then Jesus comes back. In fact, this message for us today, in the 21st century, is just as important as the message of Noah was for the people living in his day. And how many people accepted the message in Noah's day? Unfortunately, very, very few. In fact, we might even call this God's present truth. You say, "Geoff, what do you mean by that? What's present truth?" Well, there are things in the Bible that are always true. For example, that this is God's inspired word is always true. That Jesus died a complete atoning death on the cross is always true. But there are some things in the Bible that are true only for a particular period. For example, if I came preaching the same message that Noah preached, that the world is going to be destroyed by a flood, would that be true now? Certainly wouldn't be. Because God is not going to destroy the earth with a flood now. It was true back in Noah's day, but it's not true now. If I preach the same message that John the Baptist preached, that Jesus is coming as the Lamb of God to take away the sins of the world, that wouldn't be true now. He came once to die for us, thank God. But the second time he comes back, he's not coming to die. He's coming back as King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And while the message of John the Baptist was true in his day, it's no longer true in that sense today. And so this is God's present truth. That is, it is true for the period just before Jesus returns. It hasn't been true in the past because you couldn't say that Jesus was coming 400 or 500 or 600 years ago. But now he's about to return. What do you say, this message? Noah preached a special message. Lot preached a special message of warning. John the Baptist preached a special message of warning. And you can't think for a moment that God would have a huge event like the return of Jesus without a special message of warning that precedes that calamitous event. We can't think of a flood without a Noah, nor can we think of the return of Jesus the second time without a message of warning. And this is why in the book of Revelation it is so important for us to study, because the contemporary issues are outlined in the book of Revelation. And among all the conflicting voices, and there are plenty in the world today, friends, people say to me, I'm so concerned. There are so many voices all claiming to be right. Listen, friends, among the conflicting voices in this sunset hour of Earth's civilization, if you want to know truth, here it is. God's truth is contained in those three messages of Revelation chapter 14. These are the contemporary issues. These are the issues that every up-to-date preacher ought to be preaching. And if he's not preaching this, he's not up to date. He's out of date. And this message, of course, is not just some individual here or there. This is a worldwide message, because it is to go to every nation, kindred, tongue, and people. So, obviously, it'll be in Australia, it'll be in America, it'll be in the South Sea Islands, it'll be in Asia, it'll be in Europe. There won't be one place under God's heaven when this message will not be there before you get there, because it's going to every nation and kindred, tongue, and people. What do you say? Who is actually preaching this message? Listen, at the first advent of Jesus, did the established church in Jesus' day preach and accept the message that Jesus had? Unfortunately, they didn't. And in these last days, friends, it's not going to be any different. God's message has never been popular. There's never been a time when truth has been popular. For example, I have looked through the writings of men like Martin Luther, John Wesley, John Calvin, John Knox, these other great reformers, and they were wonderful men, saints of God, every one of them. I just thank God for them. But listen, friends, not one of them had the burden of this message. Why was it that Martin Luther, John Wesley, and John Knox never had the burden of this message? Why was it? Was it because they weren't good men? They weren't spiritual men? Absolutely not. The reason that they never preached this message was because it wasn't yet due. That's the reason they didn't preach it. But I believe, friends, if Martin Luther and John Wesley and John Knox and John Calvin, if they were alive today, they would be the foremost preachers of this message. Because it wouldn't have been true to say hundreds of years ago that Jesus was about to return. But in these last days, just before Jesus returns, God has a message. And that message is going to every nation, kindred, tongue, and people. And the purpose of that message is to get people ready for the return of Jesus. Well, are people hearing that message? Let me tell you a story. Some years ago, I was conducting some meetings like this in a little town in New South Wales. And before I started the meeting, I was doing a little door knocking. I called on people's homes to tell people about the meetings. And one day I called on a lady's home, and when she understood what I represented and what I was about, she didn't seem to be very happy. She said, "Why have you come here?" Well, I said, "Because God has a message for these last days." I was thinking, you see, about these three messages that contained in Revelation 14. Well, she said, "My minister's preaching it." Well, I said, "If I'd known your minister was preaching, I would go somewhere else." Well, she said, "You can go." Well, listen, I said, just before I do go, if your minister's preaching it, you'll be clear on it. And when I do a work like this, I don't usually carry a Bible this size. I carry a little one that I put in my shirt pocket, and I drew it out and I read her about these three messages. And I said, "Tell me, as we read the first message, what does it mean the hour of God's judgment has come?" Well, she just stood there and looked at me. Well, I said, with all due respect, he doesn't seem to be making that clear. So I then read her about the second message, which talks about Babylon is fallen, is fallen. I said, "Tell me, what is Babylon?" Well, again, she just stood there and looked at me. Well, I said, "I hope he's getting the third message," and I read her about the mark of the beast. I said, "Tell me, who is the mark, or what is the mark of the beast?" She just stood there and looked at me. I said, "Look, with all due respect, I don't think your minister is preaching it because you don't seem to understand anything about this message. That's why I'm coming to town. And listen, friends, nothing will stop this message. The Iron Curtain won't stop it. The Bamboo Curtain won't stop it. The Purple Curtain won't stop it. Nothing will stop this message because it is God's message. And it's going. And you can't go to a place under God's heaven tonight, but you'll find this message is being preached before you get there. Like the hymn said, from Greenland's icy mountain to India's coral strand, this message is being spoken. And everywhere you go, nothing will stop it. War won't stop it. Persecution won't stop it. And friend, it is my purpose, session by session, to go through this message, step by step. Now, I haven't outlined this message in detail in this session, not at all. But it is from this point onwards, I'm going to explain to you, we're going to go through the program. For example, in our next session together, I'm going to talk to you, what does it mean to worship God as the Creator? Do you know that the Bible has actually given us a sign whereby we can actually worship God as the Creator, that the world has largely forgotten? And we're going to go through, what does it mean the hour of God's judgment has come? Who is Babylon? What about the mark of the beast, the number of his name, the image to the beast? What does all this mean? Why are the commandments so important? Why need we be faithful to Jesus? All of these issues we're going to go through session by session. That's why I don't want you to miss a single program, because they're all, the subjects are put together. You see, it may appear to the casual person that we've just plucked subjects out of the air, but that's not true. The subjects that we have chosen all are part of these three messages of Revelation 14. The message that God says must be preached, just like the message of Noah had to be preached to get the people ready for the flood. So God's last message, these three messages, must be preached to every nation, kindred, tongue, and people. And as God spares me, that's what I'm going to do. And I want to tell you a little message of warning. Because something I have noticed wherever I conduct meetings like this, as soon as we get down to the three messages and start to open up the book of Revelation, the devil really gets active. And he will do his absolute utmost to stop you from coming to these meetings. He will make you sick. He will get you very busy. The boss will want you to stay back at work. And in every way, the devil will use some method to keep you from coming to the meetings. He has 1,000 tricks up his sleeve in order to stop you from coming to the meetings. And you beware, because that's exactly what he will do to you. Because the last thing he wants is for you to hear this message. Because if the book of Revelation exposes his activities, you can understand why he gets angry and annoyed at anyone starting to study this book. In fact, our great danger is found over here in the 13th chapter of the book of Acts. Acts chapter 13. Just come over to page 1066. This is Acts 13 and verse 40. And here is a message of warning to us all. Acts 13 and verse 40. Listen. Beware therefore, lest what has been spoken in the prophets come upon you. Now, what's been spoken in the prophets that might come upon us? What is it? Now, notice this is a quote from the Old Testament. Behold, you despisers marvel and perish. For I work a work in your days, a work which you will by no means believe, though one were to declare it to you. So can you see the message of warning here that Acts is telling us about? He said, look, you be very careful. Because when God has a message for us in our day, the human tendency is to close our ears and to not listen. You see, human nature is a very strange thing. Whenever God has had a message, human beings want to reject it. For example, if you go back to the days of Moses, you remember the people wanted to stone Moses to death. Come down a little further to the time of Elijah, and people accepted Moses but wanted to kill Elijah. Come down to the time of Christ, people accepted Moses and Elijah, but they wanted to finally kill Jesus. And in these last days, People want to accept the messages of the past, but when it comes to the message for the present truth, they want to close their ears and say, well, that's not what we've been taught. We've never heard that before. And they shake their heads. Friends, that's been the tendency of human nature down through the years. And God has given to us a warning here that we do not repeat the same mistake. And God's message is that He's getting us ready for His return. And as I said, we can't imagine that God would come back to this earth, Jesus Christ would return without a message of warning, helping us to be ready for His return. And that's what the book of Revelation is all about. Well, you say, is this message going to convert the world? Well, just come over to Revelation chapter 12 and let me read you a statement here. Revelation chapter 12 and verse 17. It's page 1182 at the back of the Bible. Revelation 12 and verse 17. And the dragon was enraged with the woman. Now, as we have noticed before, when we read something that's a symbol, the Bible always explains itself. And if you go up to verse 9 on the same chapter, it tells you who the dragon is. So the great dragon was cast out, that serpent of old, called the devil and Satan. So let's go back and notice verse 17 again. It says, and the dragon, or the devil, was enraged or angry with the woman. Now, in Bible prophecy, we're going to notice that a woman represents the church. That's something which everybody understands. In fact, in book of Revelation, we're going to notice there are two women. There's this pure woman mentioned in Revelation 12 that we're reading about. Then if you go over to Revelation 17, you'll read about a harlot woman. She's called the mother of harlots. Not a very nice picture. No woman would love to be called a harlot. But there are two churches. There is the true and the counterfeit, just as we've been pointing out in the book of Revelation. And we're going to study about this other church, this counterfeit, this mother of harlots at another time. But here we're reading about God's true church, the pure church. And the devil, it says, was enraged or angry with the church. Now, who in particular is he angry with? And he went to make war with the rest of her offspring, who keep the commandments of God and have the testimony of Jesus Christ. Can you again see the two characteristics of God's people? Those who keep the commandments and those who are faithful to Jesus. And the devil is enraged. He is livid. He is angry with God's people who would dare be faithful to Jesus and faithful to His commandments. And listen, friends, truth has always been opposed. There has never been a time in human history when truth has been popular. And in these last days, don't you think that truth is going to be popular? The devil will do everything to stop you and to stop me from accepting God's truth. As I said, he'll try to keep you away from the meetings. You know, John Wesley, that great saint of God, he wasn't preaching for 6 weeks when the established church in England put out 323 tracts against him. And Wesley had the truth for that hour, no question about that. And I know this message is going to triumph. You know, Woodrow Wilson, the once President of the United States, he made this statement: I would rather perish in a movement that I knew would triumph than triumph in a movement that I knew would perish. Now, how do I know this movement is going to triumph? Just come over to Revelation chapter 15. Revelation chapter 15, and notice with me verse 2 and 3. And I saw something like a sea of glass mingled with fire, and those who have the victory over the beast, over his image, and over his mark, and over the number of his name, standing on the sea of glass, having the harps of God. You see, God's people are pictured here in Revelation as getting the victory over the beast, the victory over his image, and the victory over the number of his name. Listen, friends, how could you get the victory over something that you know nothing about? Impossible. Of course it is. That's why God has a message in these last days, a message of warning, a message which is going to every nation and kindred and tongue and people. A message that is helping people to be ready for the return of Jesus. And as you and I are faithful to that message, God will give us strength and courage to be able to stand for truth. You know, Sir William Russell, over there in England, in the days when they used to have public hangings, people would bring their lunch and watch people hung for no less because they loved God's word. And Sir William Russell was being hung. And there they put the noose around his neck. And he was allowed to have his doctor stand alongside him up on the scaffold. And as the noose went around, he took off his watch. You remember the men used to have a vest, and then they would have a watch on a chain, and he undid it from his button and pulled it out of his pocket, and he handed it to his doctor. He said, "Doctor, you can have my watch because I'm just about finished with time, about to face eternity." And you and I, friends, are just about finished with time, about to face eternity. Jesus is coming back. He has a message that he's warning us about, like he had a message that Noah gave to warn the people at that time. But don't think for a moment, friends, that this message is going to be rushed. It will never be rushed, any more than Noah's message was rushed, any more than Jesus was rushed in his day. And just because some of our friends and our family are opposed to what we're hearing doesn't mean to say it's wrong. That's the way truth has always been. The devil has a vested interest to make sure that we don't accept it. But in these last days, friends, God is calling us to be faithful to Jesus and faithful to his commandments. And night by night, session by session, as now we outline this message, I pray to God that God will give us the courage to listen and to hear, so that we will take into our lives God's last message for this world. Let's just bow our heads together in prayer. Our wonderful Father in heaven, I just want to thank you again today for the sweet Spirit, the Holy Spirit, that has brought us to these meetings. I don't believe it is by chance that we are viewing these programs or that we're here in the meetings. Not at all. You have brought us here because you have seen that we're honest in heart, that we're looking for truth. Pray, Lord, that you will help us to understand the truth for these last days, God's present truth, a truth that is going to every nation and kindred and tongue and people, calling people to be faithful to Jesus and faithful to his commandments. Oh, Lord, keep us faithful, please, and bring us back as further we look into these wonderful truths in our next session together. I pray for Jesus' sake. Amen. Now, friends, our next program together is entitled The Secret of Stress. How to overcome stress. A forgotten secret. Something that we have forgotten all about is the key to the strengthening of our families, to strengthening our relationship with God. And we're going to outline that in our next program. Whatever you do, don't miss it. And until then, God bless you.
We hope that you have enjoyed the program you have just viewed. It is part of the Youlden World Report series titled Life After Life. Other presentations in the series are available by contacting the Youlden World Report on 0414 871 844. That is 0414 871 844.